So, good afternoon, English 218. Mike here again with a short presentation that will talk a little bit about what we did in week 1, what we're going to do in week 2, and what we'll do in week 3. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at what we have to talk about here. So, I've titled today's presentation Developing Information in Academic Literacy and/or Academic Literacy. And by that I mean this. One of the key responsibilities of this class is to prepare you to engage with academic discourse, the types of information that circulates in academic and/or scientific environments. And so, that's a new literacy, in the same way that at one time you learned how to read and write by sounding out letters and words and all of those types of things. This represents a new sort of journey in that process because, as you've seen and as you'll continue to see, you're going to be engaging with a new type and style and genre of writing and information sharing. And it really is the development of a whole new literacy. And so I want you to think of it that way, that just in the same way that you didn't learn to read and write instantaneously, there's no expectation that you're going to learn how to quickly and accurately and comprehensively read and understand academic literature overnight. This is a process that will take time. And as I alluded to in week 1, as you develop your own sort of niche and area of interest, I think you'll start to see the development of these skills accelerate because you'll become more familiar with the language and the structure and the expectations within a given field. So I think that's important to remember, that this is relatively difficult stuff, but I think it's important because as you move into your upper undergraduate and/or graduate studies, the expectation is going to be that you're going to have these skills. And I speak for myself here, but some of you have probably already experienced this, where instructors in various classes will just work from the assumption that on an assignment sheet they can tell you that you're going to use exclusively scholarly sources or information from academic journals, and the expectation is you're going to do that on your own. There's not really any instructional scaffolding that happens within the course. So this course really is that instructional scaffolding. And so it's really important that you develop these skills. And I think that if you pay close attention, it will put you ahead of most of your colleagues in those upper undergraduate classes at the 200, 300, and 400 level, because you'll have access to information that, frankly, most people don't even know exists, and even if they know it exists, they're intimidated by it and therefore don't utilize it. So that's part of the goal of the first few weeks of this course and the course writ large, is to just start to develop those literacy skills, and to, I'm going to try to share with you some of the things that I think have accelerated that learning curve for me or made the task easier. So without further ado, here's our agenda. I do want to do a quick review of last week and sort of what that was all about and how that ties into week 2. I want to talk to you a little bit more about knowledge production, and so how knowledge gets created. Again, this course and many of the courses that you'll take work from the assumption that you're going to access the cutting edge, the leading edge knowledge in a particular topic or field. And so I think it's really important for us to talk about how that knowledge gets made and what goes into an academic journal, article, or scholarly publication. And I have some things to share with you about that I think make it, on the one hand, maybe a little bit less intimidating, but on the other hand, I think instills in us a responsibility and an ethic that we have to be very cautious of the information that we use and utilize in our own writing and in our decision making. I want to talk to you about writing effective summaries, and I want to share with you a metaphor, because in academic environments, in decision-making environments, you're going to be asked to summarize what others have said about a given topic in justifying a decision or in rationalizing a study or whatever. And so I want to share with you just some basic ideas about how to write summaries, because that's the first major assignment in the course, which I'll talk about in point number 5 when we look ahead. And then I'll also talk to you about jargon. And I'll try to go as fast as possible, but I'll try to maintain a pace where I'm not flying too quickly and omitting things. So week number 1, in a nutshell, to use a cliche, is don't miss the forest for the trees. And by that I mean, when we start engaging with academic literature or research studies or what have you, it's really easy to get bogged down in the nitty-gritty details and to fixate on what we don't know rather than what we know. And so if you only take this little cliche away, that's fine. But don't miss the forest for the trees. Again, it's fine. It's completely okay, given who these manuscripts and these studies and these reports are written for. It's completely okay to not internalize and understand every piece of information that you read. What is important, and just to refresh your memory, is to understand what the researchers were trying to do, or understand how they went about trying to understand it, what they found, and what it means. And what you'll find is that is also the backbone of a really effective summary. But I want you to know that that's really the most important thing. And that's true of people with high levels of education, that when we're reading outside of our discipline or outside of our area of expertise, and again, sometimes this is even within our discipline, but reading something that's highly specialized, we're not going to know or understand everything. We should do our part and be as resourceful and as diligent as possible to try to understand those things, because that's just a good sort of ethic to have, and a good way of going about your work and your life, is to try to take in as much as you possibly can, but not to the extent that it becomes a detriment to the way that you utilize and use that information. So don't miss the forest for the trees. Right, so try to walk away with a good sense of those 4 questions, and you'll be in a good spot. That leads me to a quick discussion here about how knowledge is made. So as you've probably seen in this class and in other classes, we put a lot of value and faith in the work that is passed along or communicated in scholarly journals. And so I started, and I alluded to this, and I didn't really do it justice, so I want to come back to it in week 2. It's a pretty weird question to ask, actually, how is knowledge made? But I think it's an important one, and frankly, it's the way that many of the decisions that happen around us are made. Some are not made based on our best knowledge on a topic, but many are. How cities are laid out, how medical treatments are prescribed. Anything that requires any level of critical thinking or in-depth decision-making is usually predicated on the information that is passed along in what we call academic literature. And that academic literature, as I've told you before, is produced by people who are highly specialized, people who have studied a topic and the methodologies for researching a topic such that they are credentialed to create knowledge in that field. And that's true in all disciplines. And epistemology is the fancy word for that. That's sort of the study of how knowledge is made and knowledge is produced. But we've created a system wherein experts who usually work in a variety of capacities, primarily in universities, or in colleges, but not exclusively. Sometimes they work in hospitals, sometimes they work in non-government organizations, sometimes they work for other entities, sometimes they do work in the private sector. They study phenomena, things that happen around us that we want to understand better, and they share that knowledge through the written word. They share it through scholarly journals and publications. And the thing that I want to raise to you now, and we'll talk more about this in week 3, is that knowledge is made by humans. And it's made by humans in an imperfect system. It's made by humans who are working within an economic system that rewards publication. So I'm not sure that many of you know this, and I won't go into the same level of detail that I might in a live class, but when you attend in community college is a little bit different in this regard, that we don't have an obligation as instructors to carry out research. It's not part of the college's mission. We're a teaching institution, but if you were to drive up to Orono and go to the University of Maine, almost all of those professors have an obligation to some degree, do research. The University of Maine is actually what's called a research first, or an R1 institution, and that's a very foundational part of that college's mission, is to produce knowledge. And so what I mean by that knowledge is made by humans in an imperfect system is that there are an array of influences on how knowledge is made. Some of them are economic, some of them are infrastructural, just based on how the system works, and we'll get into those. But it's just important to know that there are influences on what gets called good knowledge, or what gets published in certain places to bring it notoriety. And one of the things I want us to be really critical of, or to be aware of, is that just because something is published in an academic journal does not mean that it's good knowledge. does not mean that it's the best information available. Sometimes that's predicated on the methodologies that are used or the methods that are used in a particular study. As just a really simple example, maybe their population that they studied, the sample that they studied, was not truly representative of a larger population. Maybe that sample was skewed based on gender or race or socioeconomic status, and inherently that would impact the results. And sometimes that happens for a very good reason. Maybe the researcher just didn't have access to a more representative sample. But the other thing that I want us to think about is that at places like the University of Maine, people earn their promotion and their change in rank. They move from lecturer to assistant professor to associate professor to full professor. They move through the system based on their publication record in conjunction with their teaching abilities. And so I just want you to know that there are economic rewards for having stuff published in academic journals, and I think we can all sort of understand that when that happens, when you introduce economic benefits and the like, it introduces a whole range of human behavior and human bias, and we see human nature sort of take over. So we'll put that in the background, but I just think it's an important conversation to have, because as we work on our summary and analysis assignment, which is our first assignment, I really want us to be cognizant of that fact that just because something is produced by an expert and just because it's published in a journal does not mean that it's good knowledge. Doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best study or the best way to answer a question or make a decision. And it's really incumbent upon us as educated people and as critical thinkers to sort of always do our due diligence and always be skeptical to some degree about the information that we're reading and vet it out. And in week 3 we'll talk about that, but it's just really important to know from the beginning that not all knowledge or not all information is created equally, and we need to be the arbiters of that. We need to be the gatekeepers, and we need to ask questions about what we're reading and not just take it as gospel. And if you do that in this class, you're going to be handsomely rewarded, because I think that's just a critical skill to being a good student, to being a scholar, and probably more importantly, just to being a good citizen. Just because you read something somewhere that has a fairly strong reputation does not necessarily, and I'll show you some examples of this in week 3, does not necessarily mean that information is valid or without its flaws, because again, knowledge is produced by humans in an imperfect system, and we'll take a close look at that. There are a host of influences on what counts as knowledge, so just keep that in the back of your mind, and that'll be helpful. So as you revise your summaries, I want you to think about a few things. And again, I already told you why I think summary writing is important, because oftentimes we are, as professionals, as active members in a particular space, we are tasked with going out and finding information about a given topic so that we can make a decision or take a certain course of action. And a large part of that work happens by virtue of summarizing what others have said about a given topic. So that's pretty abstract. So I'll ground that with an example. A few semesters ago, I happened to have a student who was already a practicing nurse who was taking this course, and she worked in a hospital, and what they were seeing was this influx of babies who were born already dependent upon opiates. So they were born to a mother who had an opiate addiction, and the babies were born with their own addiction or their own needs. And so what they were trying to determine as a department, and of course, there are many factors that go into these decisions, was they wanted to know, what is the best practice? What does the research tell? How do we deal with these babies? Do we treat them with medicine? Do we just give them time with their mother and let them sort of detox? Like what does the research tell us about the best practice? So best practice meaning best outcome, probably blending costs and benefits, etc. And so she, as part of her work in this class, did extensive research on this topic and was actually able to use that to have educated conversations in her workplace. Now, in so doing, of course, she had to summarize the work that she was reading or the research that she was reading and what it was saying. And so that's not uncommon. We have to do that all the time. I've had to do that here as an instructor at KVCC related to things like course size. Like, what is the best course size for a writing class? And what does the research tell us about the benefits of having 15 to 18 students versus 20 to 24. And again, when I go to people who haven't read that literature or that research, it's incumbent upon me to be able to summarize it in meaningful ways. So I want to give you a metaphor, and I was going to try to create a graphic for this, but my graphic design juices are a little drained right now. But I want you to think of the metaphor of altitude. So as writers, we're always sort of plotting our writing on an axis. If you picture, an X and a Y axis like you were in a math class, and we're always plotting our writing on that axis relative to breadth and depth. So breadth means how much we cover, right? Just how much information we cover. Depth is the level at which we cover it, and every piece of writing is going to be plotted a little bit differently on that axis. But I always want you to think about when you're writing summaries or summarizing information is, what altitude do I have to fly at? And so by that I mean this. If you've been in an airplane at 36,000 feet and you look out the window, you see a tremendous amount, right? The breadth of what you see is tremendous. You might see, I don't know what the mathematical equivalent, you might see 100 square miles or something, maybe even more than that, I'm not sure, right? But you see a lot, but you don't see a lot of detail, so you sacrifice some level of depth. Conversely, if you're out on top of a 500-foot mountain, I guess that's not a mountain, it's more like a hill, but if you're 500 feet in the air, you're going to see tremendously more detail, but the scope of what you see, the breadth of what you see is going to be much smaller. And so as writers, and this is a skill that's learned over time. This isn't just going to sink in because I gave you a pretty crappy metaphor. But over time, writers develop the skill to move between those various altitudes as their audience dictates, right? And so when you're writing your summaries, I always want you to ask yourself, and it may vary depending on the purpose, the context, and the audience of the summary or the work that you're doing. I always want you to think, or I want you to filter that writing through this metaphor of altitude and ask yourself, at what level do I need to fly to be the most useful to my audience? Should I give them a lot of information and sacrifice depth? Or should I just give them a little bit of information and provide a great level of depth? Now, in some cases, you may do both. But I just think it's really important for us to think at what level do we need to fly to satisfy our readers' needs. Oftentimes, we're going to be flying pretty high, at a high level of abstraction. We're not going to get super bogged down in the minutia. We're going to try to focus on those 4 questions that I've shared with you several times. But that's not always the case, and you don't want to leave your reader or readers or your audience unsatisfied by not providing the information that's going to help them the most. Okay, and also so I'm telling you this in advance because there's a tendency for developing writers who haven't had to write about scholarly information or academic literature. There's a real tendency to get bogged down in the minutia and to constantly be zoomed in on the details, and again, they lose the forest for the trees. Additionally, and this is sort of a practical detail, you don't want to forego key details, right? You always want to provide who, what, where, when, why, etc. You want to make sure that you provide information so that people can understand the context of what you're summarizing. There's a big difference between a study that took place in 1971 versus 2018, right? That's important. That helps us contextualize what we're reading. So it's important to provide the author's names, when the information was published, where it was published. There's a big difference between, and we'll talk about this, not all journals are created equally. There are impact factors. There are more prestigious journals. So something that gets published in the New England Journal of Medicine has a high level of academic currency. It's worth a lot. And those are important. That's important because it contextualizes what you've read so that the reader can better make sense of it and place it within its broader context. So those are 2 things just to think about. Fly at the right altitude and make sure that you provide that valuable context because it really will help your readers tremendously. And at the end of the day, everything we do is about our readers. Jargon, before we talk about what we're going to be doing in week 3, I just want to talk to you about jargon. I've given you an activity to write formal definitions. I just want to say this, that this course really has 3 units. Okay, the first unit is this developing academic literacy unit where we learn how to find, read, critically engage with, summarize information. In phase 2 or unit 2, you're going to be writing to the public about complex topics. And so that means you're going to write a blog post about a topic, an emerging piece of information or research, and you're also going to make a handout or a fact sheet about that, because I think it's really important when we talk about advanced academic writing. I think part of that is also being able to make knowledge useful in the world, to be able to engage the general public with information. So we'll talk about that. And then the final phase is to conduct a literature review, which is sort of like the heavy-duty work of academic literacy and writing. But at all phases, I want you to be very mindful of jargon. And for those of you who aren't aware, jargon is a language that's unique to a group of people, what we might call discourse communities, people who share a language that other folks don't have access to. You've seen this in your own personal lives with people who have certain hobbies. For instance, I'm a fly fisherman, and when I'm around other fly fishers, we can have conversations that other people who aren't up to speed on that language would not understand. We just have ways of talking about, we have verbs and nouns and proper nouns that other people just maybe don't understand or don't know. And that creates a serious communication barrier. And I'm sure we can all relate to this, that when we're communicating with people who have access to a knowledge and a vocabulary that we don't, it can be pretty uncomfortable, awkward, confusing, not very helpful. And so part of our goal in this class is to avoid jargon or to overcome jargon, and to just realize that not everybody shares the same vocabulary. And so I want you to be a hawk for jargon. And the best writers that I know can use plain, simple language to shine light on complex topics. And so I never want you to, in this course, conflate having an extensive vocabulary with good writing. Good writing is often very simple. In fact, I think that's the mark of somebody who really commands a particular domain of knowledge, or commands writing in general, is that they can make even the most complex topics or ideas really simple. And so I want you to hold yourself to that standard, and to use the skills that we're learning in week 2 to do so, and to just be very mindful of the fact that jargon really is the ultimate communication barrier, and it will become an issue for you regardless of what field you practice in. I find myself doing this a lot as a writing instructor. There is a certain way that I understand and have been taught writing that includes a vocabulary that is just frankly not accessible to students. And while it may be the sort of my natural reaction to use that language, I have to be very careful of that, because if I do deploy that language, it could create confusion. It could make students feel like they're not the audience for that communication. It can just generally make things not very orderly or efficient. So, moral of the story, just be mindful of jargon, including in your summaries. We should always, I think, shoot to cast the widest net possible and to appeal to the widest audience possible. And so we should try to write in as plain and simple a language as we possibly can. And everybody benefits when we do that. So just be very mindful of jargon. So here's what's in the pipeline. Starting next week, and you're going to read about the assignment this week, I'm going to ask you to find, read, and summarize your own academic journal article. It's really important to me that you pick a topic and pick an article that scratches some itch or satisfies some need, or aligns with some passion that you have. So don't just pick something because it's the path of least resistance. Let's use the skills that we're going to develop in week number 3 to try to find something that relates to one of our interests or our professional aspirations. So that's really what we're building towards. And in week number 3, we're going to discuss how to critically engage with scholarly literature. So I've already told you that it's flawed, that it's not always what it appears to be. So we need to be able to have a toolkit to reach into to identify those limitations and flaws. And limitations is not necessarily meant to be a negative. There are limitations to all research. There is no perfect study. There is no perfect research project. There are, by virtue of economic conditions and practical conditions and human conditions, we can't conduct perfect studies. And so by virtue of that, all research is to some degree limited. We just need to be able to understand that, recognize that, make sense of that, and use that as a way of contextualizing what we're reading. So we're going to talk about that in week 3, and that's really where we're going to develop our toolkit to be able to read something and not only understand it and be able to summarize it, but also be able to ask smart questions about it and to be able to identify its biases, its flaws, its limitations, so that we can better put it into context. Because in some cases, we're making life and death decisions or very important decisions based on that information. So we need to really know what we're working with and what it signifies and what it means. You can certainly begin looking for your article now, and I don't think that's a bad idea at all. But just know that in week number 3, there's a series of mini lectures that will walk you through how to use Google Scholar, which many of you may or may not have used, how to use Google proper, just the regular search engine more effectively, and also how to use the library's resources that as a member of the KVE community you have access to. So feel free to go out and find an article. Don't marry yourself to it, because you may find something better after week 3. But if you think week 2 is a little light on work and you want to do some more, then certainly spend some time finding an article. And I think it's a smart idea to start with just an area that you're interested in or a topic that you're interested in, and try to find out what type of scholarly activity is happening around that topic. And again, we'll talk about that more in week 3. But that should get you going. And if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. And thanks for watching.